Today I'm going to show you how to paper piece using the Carol Doak foundation papers and the Add a Quarter and the Add a Quarter Plus ruler. The pattern that we are using today is called Heaven Sent, and it's from the Have a Little Faith block of the week. And you can see on the back what it looks like when it's finished, front and back. We use Carol Doak foundation papers because you can stick them through any conventional inkjet printer or commercial printer. They're made of newsprint and they're very thin weight. They tear away easily as well after you've done your paper piecing. You can use conventional printer paper, but they come in different thicknesses and tearing them can be a little bit more difficult. This is a ordinary paper, and then you can see it with Carol Doak's. When you go to print your papers, if it's coming off of a digital image like a JPEG or a PDF, when you have selected print on your printer, there's usually the option to fit to scale or shrink to scale, and it's usually a default selection. You want to uncheck that so that the papers that you print are actual size, not shrink to fit. In this particular instance, the block that you have printed, Heaven Sent, should measure 5.5 inches from the cut line, top, bottom, left, and right. If it does not measure that, you might want to check your printer selections. Once you have printed out your paper, you're going to trim away all the unnecessary information. It just gets in your way, and it ends up looking something like this. With the Add a Quarter ruler technique, the first thing you want to do is fold back on all of these sew lines. These are their individual sew lines, and it helps with tearing your papers away after you have done the stitching, particularly if you are using conventional printing paper. And you can use any kind of cardstock, postcard, the flyers that come in magazines for this purpose. They just have to be kind of stiff. So what I do is align it right along the edge of the sew line and fold it back and give it a pretty good crease. If you are using conventional printer paper, my suggestion is to do it front and back because it is much thicker and it is harder to tear away when it's all said and done. So I would do that with every one. A common question that we get is, how do you determine how much fabric you need when you do paper piecing? Let's take a look at the pattern to begin with. Up close you can see that they are numbered in the sequence in which you are going to be stitching them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7, 8, 9, 10, and 11. You need to go in the sequence that is recommended on the paper piecing pattern. So in order to determine how much fabric you're going to need, if you are a beginner, my suggestion would be to always make your pieces larger than you think you're going to need. Unstitching this is no fun. So in this case, the first fabric I'm going to put is this one right here. It's very long. I'm going to measure from the outside of the seam allowance on one end to the outside of the seam allowance on the other end with a ruler. And in this case, it's going to measure about 8 inches from this point to this point. So I know it needs to be about 8 inches long, and then it needs to be at least 1/4 of an inch from either side of the widest portion of the fabric. In this case, the widest is about 1 inch. So I'm going to make this at least 1.5 inches. And the strip looks like this. That's going to be the piece going down the center. I will do the same with each of these other pieces so that I have everything pre-cut and ready to go before I start. The difference between the original Add a Quarter ruler and the new Add a Quarter Plus is the first one is about 1 inch wide, and it has a 1/4 inch added lip that is used to create the seam allowance when you do paper piecing. It has a pretty wide base here as well. The new Add a Quarter Plus is 2 inches wide, and they have created a bevel on one edge, and that's what you use these days to fold back your paper. So instead of using the cardstock, you would use the Add a Quarter, fold it back, and continue that way. If you don't choose to fold your papers back prior to sewing, you can still use the same technique as we're stitching, and I will show that next. Okay, so now what we do to attach the fabrics to the backs of the paper is this is the sew side of the paper foundation, and this is the side where the fabric is going to be shown on the correct side. This is the correct side of the particular piece that I'm going to use down the center. You can use fabric glue or double-sided tape in this particular instance, or even a pin if you would like, but in this case it has to be something that will hold it in place while we do the sewing. You don't want anything to go where the sew lines are going to be, whether it's glue or double-sided tape or a pin, obviously. So I'm just going to put the double-sided tape right here in the fat portion of this piece, and then I'm going to take my fabric and put it again wrong side to the wrong side so that I'm looking at the nice side of the fabric. I think I want to do it this way, and it's going to go straight down the center. And if I had a little daub of glue right there or a very small piece of double-sided tape, it might get into the middle of the sew line, so I'm just going to leave it blank for the time being. Then I flip it back over, and if you want, if you hold it up to some kind of a light source, you can actually see the shadow of the fabric and see that it is clearly covering past the sew line to the left and to the right, between 1 and 2 and 1 and 7. You want that because we're going to cut away 1/4 of an inch of that seam allowance with the add 1/4 ruler. If you look up here, you can see that I've got it just at the 1/4 inch mark, and then down below it sticks past, well past, so I don't have a problem. So an 8 inch in this particular case worked out to be pretty good, or was it 8.5? I don't remember. Alright, okay, so now we're going to use the add 1/4 ruler. With the foundation, with the cardstock, you're going to lay it between marks number 1 and 2. This is going to be our sew line, so I'm going to fold the paper foundation over the cardstock and expose the excess fabric, and take the add 1/4 ruler, this is the original one, and push it right up against that cardstock. And they also come in 12-inch lengths. This is the 12-inch add 1/4 ruler. And these are very useful when you're using large pieces like the Judy Niemeyer patterns. But you can also use the 6-inch and do this technique. I start, go halfway across, and then just slide it across that folded seam and continue. And that's my discard. So you see I have now an accurate 1/4 inch seam allowance. I'm going to add piece number 2, this piece of fabric. This is batik, so there might be a right side, there might be a wrong side. I think I'll go with this side. And I'm going to pick up the paper with the 1/4 inch seam, and I'm going to lay it right along that cut piece so that I have a nice amount of fabric. And then you can see that it's going past where this is, and it continues past this point. And at this point I can take it over to my sewing machine. Alright, so when you get ready to go to your sewing machine, the first thing you want to do is change your stitch length from its default, if you have an electric machine, like 2.5, down to 1.4 or smaller, 1.4, 1.5. You want to have a pretty tight stitch, because when you go to tearing away the fabric, the paper from the fabric, you will see right here, you see the perforations. It will actually tear away very easily as a result. Long stitches do not really help you. If you happen to make a mistake, it's a little harder to get these unstitched, so that's the drawback. But for paper piecing, we do use a shorter stitch length. Alright, so I've brought it over to my sewing machine. I've changed my stitch length to 1.4 in this case, and now I have my fabric lined up, seam allowances ready, and at this point I'm going to flip my paper over. I have not done it up to this point because anything can happen from the cutting table to the sewing machine, and sometimes the things that happen are the fabrics get flipped over backwards, so that when you sew you've got a tuck or a mistake or something. So I like to bring it over to the sewing machine where I can see everything is all lined up, everything's looking good, and at this point I will take my paper and bring it underneath the presser foot, and then carefully slide it into position. We are going to start just before the seam allowance in this particular case, and we're going to sew all the way to the end past the seam allowance. Some people will stop in this area, start and stop in the seam allowance itself, but really that doesn't keep your fabric stable when you go to trim all the excess paper and fabrics away. So I always start just before it and end just past it. If you take a look over here, it's always beneficial with long pieces that you flip it over and take a look and make sure that everything is still lining up properly. Unsewing paper piece is not fun. Tiny stitches, and I'm sewing straight down that line between numbers 1 and 2. And now I'm going into the seam allowance and just past it. Okay, so we take it off the sewing machine, clip the threads, and we flip on the back side. We're going to flip the two pieces of fabric away from each other and just use a finger press technique to smooth down the seam. Alright, so now we're going to go between pieces 2 and 3, which is right here. And again, now I'm going to show you how to use the new add-a-quarter with that beveled edge I was telling you about. You can take that and lay it right across that new sewing line, flip your fabric over, and treat it just like you did, or I did, with the cardstock. It gives you a nice crisp edge, and then I can flip it back over and use the add-a-quarter seam to trim away my excess. See, here's that add-a-quarter lip. And slide it across like the first one. Now I've got my 1/4 inch seam ready to go for piece number 3. Once again, I take the one I want and put it right sides together, lay it right up against each other so the seam allowances are going to be the same, and then walk it over to the sewing machine. Now I can flip my paper over, slide it under the presser foot, and get it into position. Make sure everything here is looking good. Oh, got it in the wrong spot. They say check twice, sew once, or do it right or do it twice. Alright, so this is going to be my sew line between numbers 2 and 3. Everything looks good on this side. And I'll go past the seam allowance again. And I'll finger press it one more time. Okay, so now we go between pieces number 3 and 4. Flip it back over again. Pull back on the crease, make sure it's nice and clean and straight. Push that 1/4 lip up against that fold. Trim away your excess. And bring in piece number 4. If you hold it up against a light, you should be able to see that the fabric, the new piece of fabric, is going to extend past the seam here, and make sure that it also goes beyond here. And it looks like I need to bring it down just a little bit farther to the right. Yeah, there we go. Okay. This is the last time I'm going to demonstrate along this side. I will pick it back up when we get towards the very end. But you understand the system. You just keep trimming, adding your new piece of fabric, flipping it over, sewing down the line, finger pressing, and then going on to the next one. So now we have done the first 6 pieces, 1 through 6, and we're ready to start on the other half. I've got my my foundation face down. I can use the add a quarter plus ruler or the cardstock, flip it over, make the crease, trim away the excess fabric, and then take the next piece of number 7 and we're going to align it again. I want to make sure that the fabric goes past the point here and past where it's going to go here, so that I know when I have finished sewing it together and flip it over, it's going to fill that whole space, including the seam allowance. Carefully carry it back over to your sewing machine and sew the line. Alright, those 2 have now been sewn. Flip it over and give it a finger press. Turn the paper over and get ready to go between fabrics 7 and 8. So we'll flip it over, give it a crease, and trim away the excess. I have my next piece of fabric ready to go. This is piece 8, this one. I don't know if you can see, but it's a gradation that I'm trying to create, that look of a ray of light. So once again, I'm going to put it in such a way that I want to make certain it's covering all of the piece, all of this piece here, including the seam allowances, top and bottom. And to double check again, I can hold it up against a light. And you can see there's the seam allowance, and it's going past. You can see the yellow right there going past where this is going to be, and then again on this side. I'll continue this for the next 3 pieces and pick it back up with you on the last one. One more method to make certain that when you add a new piece of fabric underneath, that you cover all the area that you want so that you don't make a mistake. If you can see, there's the black line of the shape that we're now adding the new piece of fabric to, this streak. If I take my fabric and lay it underneath, and I can see that all of it is covered by that new piece of fabric, there's the back side of it, then I know no matter what happens when I sew, it's going to fit that new piece, because this piece will flip back this way, as will the paper this way, and then you can see it's going to cover. So once again, I want to make certain that this whole black line will be completely covered with fabric after I've done my sew line. Okay, we're ready to put the very last piece on. My last time to do the demonstration. This is the add a quarter plus. The beveled side up against the sew line. I've folded it back, made my crease, flip it over, and trim away the seam allowance, leaving that nice clean 1/4 inch. It's covered to here. It's covered past the seam allowance on this side. Bring it to the machine, make sure everything's still good, flip the paper over and slide it into position. Make sure everything's good on this side. Yep. And go past the seam allowance. Okay, so now all the pieces, all 11 pieces have been sewn, and it looks like this. A bit of a mess. At this point you can take it over to the iron and give it a nice press so that everything is clean and straight. Before you go to trimming it away, one more time, look through a light source and make sure that all the fabric covers past the 1/4 inch seam allowance. If it doesn't, you have one more chance to fix it. Once you've cut, you're pretty much stuck with what you've got. When you're ready to trim away the excess paper and fabric, make sure that you don't cut here, but that you cut on the seam allowance line out here. I have made that mistake, and it's not a happy one. So once again, I've got it lined up against that 1/4 inch seam allowance on the outside, up and over. Flip it around, do it again. And here's the block. It's a very pretty block. Now, what we talked about at the beginning, paper piecing is not the most frugal way of using fabric, but it makes for very accurate piecing. After making this block, just wanted to let you see that it's not the most frugal method of fabric usage, but it does make for very accurate seams, and as you get better at it, you will find you don't need to have so much excess for your seam allowance before you trim everything away. The more you do the technique, the more confident you are in the size of the amount of fabric that you will be cutting. In some cases, like Judy Niemeyer patterns, she will have you pre-cut all of the pieces that you're going to be using based on the shape of the pattern, so that there's very little waste, and other people use that same method.